Elias Hawthorne had already lost everything that mattered, but that night, 3 children would change the rhythm of his grief. He had been meaning to close his eyes for hours, but the lamp kept carving the dust into gold, and the papers on the desk insisted on being read. Elias Hawthorne sat with his elbow on the ledger, and one hand stained the brown of fieldwork at dawn, the other ink dark from late-night signatures. The 2 colors met on his fingertips, a small map of the life he could not reconcile: soil and contract, harvest and ledger, memory and accounting. Outside, the dark lay heavy over the rows he had inherited. The farmhouse windows glowed like islands. A tractor's distant cough, the low breathing of a vast place, the living pulse of a land that had fed generations, none of it reached him, not in the way it once had. Since his father's funeral, the property seemed both enormous and shuttered. He lived with rooms full of things he could name, and an absence as precise as the notches a carpenter makes for a missing piece. On the desk, the stack of documents waited, edges like teeth. The top sheet listed parcels, names, acreages, the empty columns indicating income that might cushion the coming years. Below, a sheet with the numbers he understood too well. Projected shortfalls, the slow erosion of profit margins, the offers from developers who would eat the fields and leave memories boxed up in concrete. Selling would solve an immediate problem. Selling would protect the bank balances that made the rest of his life smooth, sterile, careful. Selling might also mean the end of an ecosystem, the families who came each season, the small houses clustered like pebbles on the far ridge, the nursery where women sang in the morning while they shelled beans. He read another paragraph. The words blurred. There was a photograph he kept turned face up on the desk, the only thing on the mahogany not owned. His father, hands like flint, smiling at him with an expression that refused to fit into any market analysis. Elias had been a son long before he had been a steward or a creditor. Now the photograph sat like an accusation. You are not managing grief well. You are measuring the world with numbers because numbers will not ask you why you are quiet. He looked up at the lamp, at the halo around the desk, and then at his hands. The ink and soil did not mix. They sat side by side, twin stains that somehow made the problem feel even more complicated. The knock on the office door arrived late, soft and uncertain. It was a small sound, like feet testing a floorboard, and for a moment he imagined it could be the wind shifting in the hall. Then the door opened, and a woman stepped in, carrying 3 small pairs of hands and a cluster of restless limbs under her arms. Clarice moved as if she belonged in the shadows and in the light. Her apron had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a knot, she likely rearranged between baths and meals. Behind her, 3 boys leaned into the doorway with the irreverent bravery of children who live on the edge of stability, tired, curious, and attentive in one breath. The youngest's shirt had a smear of soil at the hem. The middle boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. The oldest studied the man behind the desk as if he were an exhibit to be cataloged. They were small. They were loud in an orderly way. Small requests, a giggle, the clinking of a toy truck against the doorframe. Elias felt the air press in around them differently. The lamp's halo widened, softer. Sound parked in the room in a new way. Clarice's face was a map of effort. There was a tired set to her jaw and an economy to her movements that spoke of long nights and living by necessity. She held a small tote with cleaning cloths and a thermos, and one of the boys, his hair a shock of curls, reached forward and touched Elias's hand as if testing for warmth. The oldest spoke first. "You sad," he announced. His words were clear and simple. He said it like a fact. Elias started because children said what adults danced around for years. He had not expected the bluntness. There are degrees of grief, but no one needed to teach a child how to name what was in plain sight. Clarice flushed, half embarrassed, half protective. "They get like that sometimes," she said. explaining without meaning to explain. He forced a small smile that in itself felt rehearsed. "They have good eyes," he said. He did not know if he meant them for the boys or himself. The oldest boy crawled into the chair beside him before Elias could frame a response. The two smaller ones clambered up as well, as if gravity was stronger for children who had learned to cling. They tucked their knees against his legs, small socks cool against his trousers. One of them rested a head on his shoulder and breathed out. The empire of the study shrank in that second. Papers seemed heavier, less urgent. The sound he heard then was simpler than the ledger's rustle. The soft, astonishing weight of 3 pairs of small hands finding purchase on his chest. They held him like an anchor, nimble fingers investigating the hollow of his throat, the stubble on his jaw, the scar that ran along his left knuckle from a long-ago harvest. The triplets' trust was immediate and earnest, the kind of trust people tended to earn slowly with food and consistency, not plucked like a ripe fruit in an office at midnight. He realized absurdly and sharply that these were children who did not often trust strangers. His mind supplied little backstory fragments, an image of a woman with too many things on her arms, a door held open by a broom, a small cot in a crowded room where the boys slept close enough to hear each other breathe. Children like these were cautious for reasons you could count. Houses changed, shifts ended, promises frayed. For them to climb into his lap without a second glance was not casual. It felt like a verdict. "You're Mr. Hawthorne," the middle one said, as if testing whether names matched faces. "Papa said your fields are big." Elias swallowed. "They are," he managed. His voice sounded old in a way that surprised him. "Very big." The smallest, who had been tracing the rim of the desk with his finger, looked up and declared in the tone of someone who has learned what works in the world, "You look like you need a hug." Such pronouncements cut through metrics and memories. A laugh rose in his throat and then fell away, because laughing felt like a betrayal to the ledger. He had been preparing to authorize a sale that would reduce the workforce by 20%, to sell off the north parcels to a developer who promised immediate capital. It was a rational move. It was cold. It was one signature away from altering dozens of lives. He imagined the seasonal crews who would be told to find work elsewhere, the women who would not have breakfast money, the children whose routines would be broken. He imagined how his father would have lectured him at length about stewardship, and how his father now couldn't, because he had already gone. Clarice lingered at the doorway, steady. Her palms clutched the strap of her tote. She began, then stopped. There was a thing she wanted to ask without sounding like she was asking for a favor. "I clean these offices sometimes," she said, naming what she did, because naming was sometimes all a person had when their hands were full. "Night shift. I bring them to the sitter in the mornings, and the sitter's leaving. She can't anymore. I don't have anywhere to put them while I'm here. I thought maybe." Her voice curled into itself. The boys answered without need for translation. "He can work," said the oldest, certifying it as fact. It was Clarice's life, Clarice's responsibility, but the boy's simple proclamation landed on Elias like a pebble into still water, ripples moving outward. Elias's first instinct was to close the office door and return to the ledger's safety. The papers would not sting, the numbers would not demand questions about childcare or rent. But the boy's hands were still warm on his trousers, and the softness of their hair, and the way the youngest opened his mouth to show a small, brown, toothless grin, made the ledger seem like an encroaching distance. He found himself saying something he had not planned. "We have a small nursery on the property. Miss Patel runs the morning shift. It's for the field workers' children mostly. It might have space." He had not intended generosity. He had intended pragmatism. Finding a place for the kids meant Clarice could continue to clean at night. But as the sentence left his mouth, it felt like a door opening that could not be easily shut. Clarice's face tightened in a way he could now see, fear braided with relief. "It's not charity?" she asked, before the question could be swallowed by manners. "No," he said. The word came out clipped. He straightened, aware of the papers. "I meant, if there's room, I can offer you a position during the day, an assistant. There's work to be done, liaising with the crews, helping coordinate schedules, records. It pays," he added, because the word mattered. "A living wage, benefits. It's—" He stopped. The office told him to be exact, and the sight of the triplets undercut his precision. Clarice's eyes flashed. "You mean like a real job?" She looked at the boys as if to test whether they would understand that their mother might suddenly be counting on a place that was not hatching out of nowhere but carved with expectations and rules. "Yes," Elias said, and it felt heavier than he expected. "We can set hours. Childcare will be included. There's a room above the old packing shed we could clear out. Miss Patel can help with the mornings and the nursery in the afternoons. I don't want you to think I'm handing out favors." He watched her process. Pride and necessity have a complicated dance. Many of the people who worked on the land had turned down help in the past because they could not risk broken expectations or doors that closed. Clarice's mouth pursed with 1,000 small calculations. What it would mean to go in each day, to be judged, to be seen. She had scavenged dignity from the shape of her days for years. She balanced on a high wire of independence and need. "You're offering me a job?" she repeated, almost to test whether hearing it aloud would change its character. Elias looked at her and felt the order of the room knock against him. He had thought of the job as a small administrative fix. For her, it might mean a home with fewer tight corners, a bed that opened in the morning, a predictable wage, a winter not stitched together out of borrowed coins. He also felt the prickle of unease, the risk of being misread, of wielding power in a place where someone else would be vulnerable. "Yes, a job," he said again, more carefully. "Real pay, training. If you want it, you'll have the role formally, with paperwork. No one will pronounce it charity on your behalf." Clarice exhaled. The triplets shifted, as if they had released a small collective breath. The youngest curled his fingers into a fold of Elias's shirt and tightened, a little anchor of certainty. There was a silence after that, thick and raw. The night outside pressed its ear. Elias realized the offer had consequences he had not fully scoped. If he took on the responsibility of a nursery and a stable job for one woman, that implied a commitment that might ripple into other decisions he had been avoiding. If he created a precedent, he would have to defend it with policy, with money, with his name on ledgers that now he did not trust. But the idea of refusing, of sending them back into a patchwork of solutions that never held, felt small and cruel. The boys began to hum an odd tune, a half-song made of words and breathing. They did not understand assets or bond covenants, but they understood rooms. They understood when a lap was a different kind of home. Elias felt the slow, unfamiliar ache of want for something other than solitude. In the presence of their small trust, he understood that grief could be a narrowing thing. It had closed him into a list of compromises and allowed nothing in. The three little bodies had opened him without asking. Clarice wiped a hand across the top of a boy's head. "I don't suppose you'd want someone who's never used a ledger," she said. Her laugh was a small, sharp thing, uneasy. "I don't even know how I can follow directions." "You can learn," he said. He offered the job in the way one opens a gate. Sometimes it closes, sometimes people pass through. He wanted to promise her stability, but promises lived in the daylight of signed pages. "We'll train you. Miss Patel can help. There's paperwork. We'll sort your hours. We'll pay you fairly." The triplets, as if satisfied that a decision had been reached, all three leaned their heads closer. The youngest found his face against Elias's chest. The oldest whispered, for clarity's sake, "You're our friend now?" The question landed like a pebble, and Elias found himself answering not with the dry legal mind he had carried into the room a few minutes earlier, but in the blunt way children understand. "I'll try." Clarice's eyes filled quickly and quietly. They were not theatrical tears. They were the tears of someone who had been walking on glass for years and whose feet finally touched soft earth. "If you mean it," she said. He nodded. He did mean it, but mean was not enough. He would have to sign commitments, move money, speak in public. He would have to shift his life into the very things he had been avoiding. When Clarice left the room, the triplets scampered ahead and were given their jackets by a woman who had appeared at the doorway like a guardian. Miss Patel, a small, quick woman with hands that knew children from work and affection, stepped in and smiled in that tired way of people who had raised others' children and kept their own alive. "Late night, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, as if the farm had not just shifted in its axis. Elias felt gratitude like a weight he had not expected to carry. "It was," he answered. He watched Clarice walk away, carrying her tote, their small shapes swallowed by the corridor. He thought of making the offer formal, of setting terms and timelines, and protecting her from the gossip he knew would rise like steam in small towns. He thought of the ledgers and the developer's envelope waiting like a vulture on his desk. He thought of his father and of the way grief made decisions dull. When the office door clicked behind them, he resumed his seat and looked at the stack of papers. The lights in the nursery across the yard were still on. He could imagine a small circle of light where Miss Patel hummed and the triplets slept, where for a couple hours they would dream without counting coins. He turned back to the first sheet, to the parcel list, to the column that whispered of a sale that might save headlines and spreadsheets. He rubbed his fingers together until the soil and ink smudged into a new, indistinct brown. The contact ink made a little smudge on the margin of his thumb, the kind of mark that some farmers considered a badge, proof that one's decisions left the same traces as planting a line of seed. He picked up the pen and then set it down. He picked it up again and felt the weight of it. The pen did not decide. He thought of the faces of the workers at dawn, of the woman who had told him years ago that the farm was not his to hold, but his to steward. Stewardship required more than numbers. He knew that in a way he had not been willing to know while his father's voice was only memory. For a long while he sat there and did not sign. The lamp kept burning. On the desk, the photograph of his father seemed to watch the ink shadow. Outside, the field slept. Inside, small breaths rose in a far-off nursery, the sound of children who did not yet understand the shape of the world in which they had been born. If this beginning caught at something in you, stay, there's more to come. Clarice walked back to her small apartment on the edge of the village with the triplets under her arms and the offer like a heat in her chest. She had accepted, tentatively, guardedly, because choice in her life had long been a matter of survival. The night smelled of frying oil and wet earth. Someone down the street hung sheets that fluttered in the rainlight. She kept thinking, job, pay, training, nursery. The words moved through her like possible oxygen. At home, the apartment was 3 rooms and a hallway, warm with the smell of cooking and the exhausted relief of bodies that had been doing too much for too long. João, her younger brother, sat at the small table with a hand on his forehead. He had been waiting with the impatience of someone who loved hard and worried harder. "You took it?" he asked before she could speak, the question a wire stretched taut. "I did," she said. She set the boys on the bed and watched the youngest trace a pattern in the blanket as if rehearsing the shape of sleep. João rubbed his eyes. "Clarice, are you sure? Elias Hawthorne isn't like the other employers. You know that. Power." He shrugged as if the word were a physical thing that might crush someone without meaning to. "I know," she said, "but it's a job, João. It's steady. It's better hours." She spoke it like a list of proof, a rational argument against fear. He said full pay. He said benefits. He said training. The words did not make all the shadows go away, but they did rearrange them. João's face softened and hardened at once. He had held a dozen kinds of caution for his sister over the years. "Just don't be alone a lot," he warned. "Keep the papers, read everything. Don't let them say charity, don't let them take—" Clarice smiled, a small rueful thing. "I won't," she promised. I can read. I'll ask questions. He folded his hands like a man making himself ready. If he tries anything, the sentence trailed. Their family had known too many stories of things going wrong when someone trusted with both openness and need. I know, she said, and they both knew too well the list of things that could go wrong. But she had accepted. She had put her hand to the gate and stepped through. A job again would not erase the years of walking on glass, but it offered a place where the boys would not have to be folded into a neighbor's house every morning, where their lunches would be on a schedule. The boys ate their bread with a methodical hunger. The oldest told a story about a scarecrow and a fox. The middle one sang a tune he had made up, and the youngest fell asleep mid-sentence with a crumb on his cheek. Clarice sat watching them, the relief softening a strictness that had been like armor. She pictured the nursery she had been shown earlier, bright walls, mattresses low to the ground, a window that looked out over a patch of wildflowers. She imagined Miss Patel's hands guiding them into a morning where someone else would know to braid hair, to bring socks, to boil water for porridge when the mornings got cold. Still, the offer had come with the shadow of the ledger. It had come from the same man who might sign away livelihoods if the numbers demanded. She would be part of his world now. She would be visible in his books and in his policies. Visibility could mean dignity, but it also meant exposure. She had been exposed to an uneven compiler of mercy. She recognized the risk and weighed it against the boy's small fingers in the lap of someone he trusted and an absent mother's fear of the next month's rent. Elias, in the farmhouse, finally moved to his desk and picked up the phone. He called Mr. Taxman, the consultant whose voice on the other end of the line had a way of slicing through sentiment. They talked in fields of figures, projected yields, anticipated cash flow, proposals to parcel off the north 30 acres. As they spoke, Elias felt an odd compulsion to be exact, to lay out terms that were defensible. He outlined a tentative idea, holding back certain parcels, restructuring the payroll, and piloting a workers' fund to soften the blow to seasonal families. He also proposed a smaller thing, less defensible in cold calculation, but perhaps more necessary. A pilot nursery funded by the estate's operating budget, and stable positions for several people who had been relying on rotating informal mornings. He explained the logic in fiscal terms because that was how his advisors would hear it. He threaded the moral argument through the numbers anyway, because for the first time since his father's funeral, he felt the two as parts of the same sentence. Later, sitting back, he thought of Clarice's face when she had left. He recalled the boy's hands. He found himself flipping open a different ledger, one where he made notes in the margins that were not for the accountants. Names of families he'd known for years, the total of people who might be affected if he signed the parcel sale, the cost in human hours if the Northfields went under. He did quick math in his head and then did it again with different assumptions. A reduced salary for him for a few years, a temporary reallocation of the farm's maintenance budget, a funds pool seeded from his own money. He ran numbers until the neat columns blurred. He knew the decision would ripple. He also knew that the act of offering Clarice something had launched a chain of obligation he could not politely disown. Invitations, once given, required accountability. He had not thought in that language for months. He had been alone long enough to forget the simple mechanics of community, that it is a weave of small commitments. That night he could not sleep. He rose and walked the length of the hall to the nursery window. Through the glass he could see the faint arrangement of small cots and a night lamp like a small moon. It was empty now, but the light was like a promise. He thought of the young men who had worked the harvest with his father, the women who had sat on porches peeling peas, the children whose laughter had been part of the farm's chorus. He thought of how the work of landmaking had always required more than acreage. It required people whose lives fit into the harvest rhythm. He went back to his study and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. He did not sign anything. Instead, he wrote a list of things he would need to change, to make what he had promised real. A formal job description for Clarice, instructions to the payroll administrator, a meeting with the labor foreman, a letter to the seasonal workers explaining a pilot childcare program. He wrote the names of people he would have to speak with, and circled the words Workers' Fund like an incantation he did not quite believe he would summon. Dawn found him still at the desk. The lamp finally burnt out as light crept along the rows outside. The sound of birds was precise and endless. He felt as though he had walked a little closer to something he could not yet name. Clarice woke the boys and set about the morning ritual with an efficiency that could be cruelly beautiful. There is an art to compressing 100 small chores into an hour that presents itself as calm. She dressed the boys, smooth hair that freckled in the sunlight, packed 3 small cloth bags with the breakfasts she had made the night before. Joan watched from the doorway with a protective fussiness, and Clarice allowed him to fuss because fussing was caring, and a brother's hands are sometimes better than any comfort. The bus ride to the farmhouse smelled like diesel and wet dirt. The boys clung to her hand as if it were a rope that tethered them properly to place. At the farmhouse entrance, she felt watched. There were other employees, men in work boots and women with calloused palms, who eyed her with polite curiosity. Some offered smiles, some did not. A few looked at the boys and then down at the wornness of her shoes and calculated how the world had arranged itself for people like her. Miss Patel greeted them in the nursery with an ease that smelled of experience. "We'll see if we can find a place for everyone," she said, and Clarice felt the words buoy her like a small, vital thing. She signed a paper because Elias had been right. There would be forms in triplicate for everything that mattered. She listed her full name, her ID number, and then paused before signing the wage agreement and the schedule. Her signature wavered, not from doubt of the job, but from the weight of chronic uncertainty, the way a person signs a new contract when they have been burned by broken promises in the past. "Any questions?" Miss Patel asked, gentle but with the clear tone of someone who had seen questions and answers before. "Just that that it's real," Clarice said. "It's real if you hold it real," Miss Patel answered. She folded a hand over the contract and looked Clarice in the eye. "We'll help you." The first day was an uneven geometry of small tasks. Elias watched Clarice from across the yard as she moved with a careful economy, learning ropes and lists, striking off names on inventories, recording the weight of feed, marking which greenhouses needed repair. She made mistakes, misfiling a label, misreading a code, and each time someone corrected her, Elias saw his own father's style of correction flash in his mind, and then the manner in which he intervened now, not with a rebuke, but with a word and a demonstration, offering time instead of shame. Not everyone welcomed the change. Vanessa, who managed the schedules for the crews and had been on the property for 20 years, watched with a narrow smile. She had a way of folding her arms that could cut deeper than words. "We've always done things a certain way," she murmured to a coworker, loud enough for Clarice's ears to catch. The coworker shrugged and looked away. The way Vanessa said it suggested not just conservatism, but a dislike for the disruption of old rhythms. Regina, who worked the front desk and tended to 1,000 small crises, leaned forward when she saw Clarice fumble and offered a helpful hint. "Ask 3 questions," Regina advised when Clarice hesitated over a form. "Not 1, not 10, 3. Then you can do the rest." Elias found himself stepping in once when a contractor's tone edged toward condescension as Clarice explained a discrepancy in a delivery. He did not raise his voice. He set a boundary with a quiet exactness. "We treat everyone who works here with respect," he said. The contractor blinked and muttered, and the room moved on. The act was small but public. It registered beyond the moment. Clarice left that first day with her feet aching and a little more color in her cheeks. The boys were collected safe by João at the nursery door. They tumbled out of their chairs and into the cab of their aunt's truck as if the morning had been a marvelous adventure. Clarice's steps home were slightly steadier. She had not yet been unduly humiliated. She had not yet been asked to trade anything but time for her wages. The job felt like a fragile promise, but promises that are practiced daily become stronger. She slept that night with hands that had known both a mop and a ledger. and with the sensation of a life that had moved a degree closer to steadiness. Elias, meanwhile, began to make small adjustments. He scheduled a meeting with the foreman, with Miss Patel, and with the payroll administrator. He wrote out a formal job description for Clarice and made sure the payroll lines reflected the agreement they had made. He began, hesitantly, to reframe his accounting, not as a list of sacrifices to be avoided, but a ledger that could carry obligations intentionally. There was resistance to come. There would be questions about budgets and precedent and practicality. There would be gossip and raised eyebrows and, in the worst cases, attempts to undermine the nursery's purpose. But for the moment, there was, at least for one woman and 3 boys, a jump in the arc of days, from precarious to plausible. For Elias, there was an opening, small and treacherous, toward a life that resembled responsibility more than isolation. At the edge of the fields, where the horizon met a sky loosed with clouds like sails, Elias walked with his hands in his pockets and felt, in the hollow where grief had settled, a faint stir. It was not the end of sorrow or the folding of regret. It was rather a small loosening, a recognition that a person could be shaped by both ledger and ledger, that stewardship required more than figures, that decisions could be held gently and still firm. He had not signed any irreversible paper. He still held the pen that could carve away parcels and quiet livelihoods. But he also had seen 3 small hearts press into the hollow of his chest and had been unable to put them back in the drawer. He returned to his house with the day's light slipping out of the sky. Behind him, on the property, people moved, some with hope, some with skepticism. The farm breathed in its complicated way, neither perfect nor simple, but real and breathing. And somewhere between the desk and the nursery, between the ledger's neat columns and the messy, miraculous weight of 3 small hands, a decision was beginning to take shape that would ask more of Elias than the signing of a sheet of paper. The next week settled into a new rhythm that smelled of coffee, damp hay, and the constant small business of living. Dawn began to arrive with a different sound, not just the mechanical rhythm of tractor starting, but the intervening chorus of small feet padding toward a nursery, the rustle of a sheet folded with care, the soft murmur of someone who had learned to make lists and keep them. Clarice's learning curve was steep in the polite way of things that matter. The farm's documents were a language of codes and columns. The crates and seedlings had names in Latin that refused to be simplified. She learned to read weight tags, to log deliveries, to note which greenhouses needed ventilation. She learned to make phone calls in the farmhouse office with a voice that did not sound small. Miss Patel taught her to take inventory with a steady patience. Regina taught her to frame questions so they landed as competence, not insecurity. Every time she got an answer right, a small sun rose and the tightness behind her ribs eased. The triplets grew too, like little plants toward the light. They arrived each morning with palms still sticky from breakfast and faces that described the world plainly. Who's coming today? Where's the red tractor? Can we pick tomatoes later? Their trust in Elias remained concrete. They ran to him without hesitation, crowding his knees when he checked fence lines or sat on the porch. He became, in their taxonomy, the man who smelled like soil and counted things in a way that sometimes put food on the table. They called him simply Uncle Elias because the word for family in their world was flexible and immediate. That label did not mean intimacy beyond what was proper. It meant presence. It meant someone who would bend to tie a shoelace. Not everything was gentle. The farm had long memories, and change, especially change introduced by someone in authority, made old loyalties suspect. Vanessa's discontent was practical and small at first. A delayed comment, a look that suggested Clarice's presence upset a balance. She said the right things about tradition and the difficulties of navigating budgets, but inside her sentences was a thread of resentment. She had been there when the foreman's coffee went cold, when contractors were held to standards, when the strings of the operation were invisible to outsiders. In her mind, Clarice was a newcomer who threatened a roster of unspoken rules. The first sharp breeze came at the payroll run. A vendor's invoice had been misread. An extra zero dropped where a decimal should be. The mistake sent a small panic through the office until Clarice realized she had been looking at the wrong column. She corrected it quickly. The payroll administrator signed off, but the rumor mill had already slotted a version that pleased itself. The new assistant had nearly cost someone their wages. Vanessa's mouth did not need to invent much before people filled the gaps. Clarice felt the weight of that whisper the way one feels a fly at the back of the neck. Not fatal, but nagging. Juan, who had followed her to the farmhouse once to hand over a box of cleaned bibs, noticed the way she flinched when someone looked too long, and he tightened his jaw in frustration. "You doing okay?" he asked one evening, when the boys had been bathed and were asleep, and Clarice had the house to herself. "I am," she said. Her voice held honesty and the sort of stubbornness that has been earned from years of practice. "I'm learning. It hurts sometimes, but I'm here." The other wind that blew was more structural and less personal. The developers' letters kept arriving. Their offer improved with each iteration. The parcels on the North Ridge had buyers, promises of cash, of concrete, of instant balance sheet happiness. The farm's board, composed of a small coterie of longtime advisors and a handful of absentee investors who loved tidy returns, favored a quick resolution. Some meetings grew tense. Elias found himself repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed even to his own ear. Short-term liquidity, mitigating downside, protecting legacy. But inside those phrases, his chest had altered. The ledger had a new column now, people. He began to test how far he was willing to go. In a quiet office lit by a low lamp, he drafted a proposal that read like the script of a different life. It reduced his own draw for the coming 2 years and redirected operating funds to a workers' emergency pool. It proposed the nursery be expanded into a formal childcare program for seasonal workers' children staffed by trained attendants and subsidized so parents would not pay beyond a small manageable fee. It suggested a pilot program for contract restructuring, offering longer guaranteed weeks during key seasons, modestly reduced contractor margins in exchange for steadier employment, and training budgets to raise productivity in ways that would not rely solely on cutting wages. Putting the ideas on paper felt like stepping off a curb. He sent the draft to the foreman and to his most trusted advisor, a retired agronomist called Hal, who had worked alongside Elias's father. Hal read the pages slowly, took his time as old men do with things that might upset their sleep, and finally tapped the corner with a stained forefinger. "Sounds like you're making a farm that keeps people," Hal said. "That's not a bad plan, but someone's going to want to know how it pays eventually." The answers to how would be found in months, not minutes. Elias knew that. He also knew that the act of offering Clarice a job had shifted something inside him he couldn't walk back from without feeling small. He had to show up for the decision, publicly, or the nursery would be nothing but an idea to be laughed away. The decisive meeting was scheduled on a Thursday when the light had the brittle quality of late autumn and the leaves on the sugar maples clung like small flags. The boardroom, which smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, filled with people who loved forecasts and spreadsheets. A phone screen glowed here and there with numbers and charts, and the air carried a tense, polite fatigue. Elias presented his proposal without flourish, words measured. He showed the numbers he had drawn from the farm's past and the tenuous models for its future. He spoke of obligations, to the seasonal crews, to families, to a landscape that expected continuity. He laid out the pilot: childcare expansion, workers' fund, reduced personally drawn income, and capital reserves shifted for 2 years, renegotiated contractor margins, and an intent to measure outcomes: retention, productivity, community health. Some in the room listened with caution, others with the bland professional detachment of people who talk about ethics as if it were a line item. One board member, a man who had swapped farm stock for a life of short-term capital gains, asked the question they had all privately rehearsed: can we afford this? Elias did not offer a booming rhetoric of benevolence. He offered spreadsheets and contingencies and a clear list of how he would fund the pilot and a timeline for reassessment. "We can afford it if I take less," he said. There was a silence. "For the next 2 years," he added. "And if, after a year, the numbers aren't improving, we reassess. But I'm not going to sell the North Ridge or pair staff to meet a quarter's figures, not without exploring this." Vanessa's corners creased. She, who had built her reputation on keeping systems tight and people disciplined, did not like the interruption. She countered with logistics, questions about oversight, about who would run the childcare, about unintended consequences, and in tone, it was respectable. The debate that followed was legalistic until the legalism lost its armor and revealed a deeper split: money as metric versus people as the metric. When a vote was called, the room was split. The conservative wing feared precedent and liquidity constraints. The progressive few saw long-term value in steadiness, retention, and moral reputation. Elias had calculated the numbers to the dizzying decimal. He had lined up Hal's tentative endorsements and Regina's logistical support. He had also, in a quiet flush of humility, brought Clarice's job description and the nursery's current attendance figures to demonstrate the immediate need. The vote ended with a narrow approval. The pilot launched with a guarded optimism its organizers could taste like iron. The paperwork was heavier than anyone anticipated. There were legal forms, tax implications, and a small outrage among contractors who felt constrained. Several investors grumbled and withdrew a line of credit they had been minded to extend. Elias absorbed the effect by tightening his personal spending and drawing on a contingency fund his father had set aside for emergencies. It hurt. The margins grew thin. He felt the reduction in his account like a physical loss, less cushion, fewer indulgences, but also like a new kind of warmth, a sacrifice with an identity. Change did not move smoothly. The childcare program opened, and at first the sign-up list was thin. Workers were cautious. Many had been burned by promises before. Clarice found herself at the front of the effort, not as a figurehead, but as a connector. She walked through the field barracks, spoke to women with gloves still powdered by soil, asked about times and money and their fears. She listened. She made calls. She brought small boxes of biscuits to the first meeting, an old gesture that turned strangers into people who remembered the taste of kindness. In weeks, the nursery's attendance grew. Parents who had feared losing wages to unpaid time now had the proof of a place that might hold their children through harvest. Vanessa's scrutiny hardened into sabotage that was legal but mean. She tightened schedules in a way that occasionally left gaps in coverage, assigning Clarice shifts with extra paperwork or sending contractors to double-check inventories Clarice had already reconciled. The aim was clear: wear the newcomer down. Clarice felt the pressure like a slow weathering. She slipped once in front of suppliers and misread the label of an order of certain seedlings. The mistake cost time and a small square of money. Vanessa announced the error strategically, and a ripple of satisfaction darted through the office. Elias watched. He could have handled it in a private scolding or a quiet reprimand. He chose instead to make the matter public in the most ordinary way. At the weekly staff meeting, he pulled up the day's agenda and asked Regina to explain the change in procedures that would prevent future confusion. He praised Clarice's quick correction and the way she had reached out to suppliers to find a more timely substitute. He was precise and firm. "We correct errors here and learn from them," he said. "We don't let them become reasons to cast judgment." The tone was neither sermon nor defense, merely an ordinary boundary that allowed those inside the operation to see what behavior would be tolerated. Vanessa sulked, and she scowled. She retaliated by organizing a union of sorts among the older staff who worried about precedent. Their argument was not purely mean. They feared cost-cutting in areas unseen. They worried about fairness to long-serving employees. These were real concerns. Elias opened the books for a transparent conversation, and they talked through the numbers. He allowed questions.
He accepted critiques and made adjustments, clarifying criteria for the Workers' Fund, guaranteeing that long-serving employees would get first consideration for any new positions created, and promising a clear audit after the pilot year. These adjustments calmed some and provoked others. The point was that the changes were not gestures. They were administrative moves with names on them, policies lining up like fence posts, clear, practical, and public. People began to notice the shift in tone. Where work had been silent and procedural, it became possible to speak. A foreman named Mateo, who had been skeptical, approached Elias days later in the field office with a small, reluctant smile. "The crews are showing up more on time," he said. "Kids at the nursery seem to make a difference. Men come with their kids' lunch and a new kind of focus. Maybe it'll stick." The first harvest after the pilot start was lean. Weather had been unkind and a fungus had taken a corner of the greenhouse, but the workers floated in unexpected resilience. They spoke of mornings when they could leave children in the safe presence of someone trained to care. They said they slept 10 minutes longer without the anxiety of how their child would be fed before a long day. Workdays were not magically longer or lighter, but the margin for living expanded just where it needed to: time. Small things added up. For Clarice, the months were a mixture of triumphs and private friction. She attended a training session on inventory software and surprised herself by sitting through the instruction with a focus she had not known she possessed. She developed an efficient method of labeling crates that reduced errors. She began to mentor a new hire, a young woman who had never worked off the morning shift. Joanne watched his sister return from the farmhouse with small lightnesses in her step. His warnings moderated into a steady cheer. When a door of trust had opened in his sister's life, his instinct was to stand guard, but he found himself also standing proud. At home, the triplets' bedtime stories multiplied. Elias would sometimes arrive at the nursery after dusk and find them in a tangle of blankets and whispered conspiracies. They would show him the scrape on the porch step where they'd taken a tumble that morning, or the way the red tractor's exhaust bent like a crooked finger toward the sky. He listened and answered with the sort of gentleness he had not permitted himself in years. His house, too, changed in small domestic ways. The music played in the kitchen shifted from melancholic strings to a playlist that had a record of bright, simple songs. He found himself buying 3 small wooden cars one afternoon and leaving them on the nursery shelf, the grain warm in his hands. The bigger test, the real crossroad the farm community had been waiting for, arrived on a morning when an insurer's assessment for the upcoming fiscal year produced a figure that felt like a threat. A drought 2 summers prior had left the soil less forgiving. Investments needed for irrigation were urgent. The developers redoubled their offers, and, behind the scenes, several large investors weighed the cost of staying. Pressure arrived in friendlier tones, calls that asked whether the pilot's expenses were prudent and whether it made sense to secure the farm's balance sheet by liquidating parts of it. Elias convened a meeting that rippled through the farm's leadership. He presented 2 scenarios: a sale that would immediately shore up reserves but that would reduce labor needs and disrupt families, and a slower path that relied on restructuring debt, an aggressive plan to increase yields through modern techniques, and a reallocation of his own capital to sustain the Workers' Fund and childcare for 2 more years. The second path required sacrifice on his part and faith that the improved stability would pay dividends in productivity and community resilience. The first was the easy arithmetic of immediate survival. In the meeting room, the lines were clear. Supporters of the sale argued that the market did not wait and that the farm's mission could be preserved on a smaller scale. Advocates for the people-first approach argued that the farm's long-term viability and social license were tied to how it treated its workers and to what steadiness looked like when bad years arrived. The debate turned sharp. Voices rose slightly.
The old capitalist logic of the investors felt at odds with the day-to-day farm that Clara and the others had nurtured. Elias's decision had to be public and irreversible in some measure. He could have proposed a partial sale, a compromise, designed to buy time. But compromise, he had learned, sometimes becomes a way to avoid the moral spine of an action. He could feel his father's stern face in the photograph on his desk, and he felt, too, the 3 small hands that had first pried the drawer of his heart open. The ledger would be affected, so would his reputation among shareholders. There was nothing simple about any outcome. He chose the slower path. He announced plainly that he would not sign a sale that would disrupt more than a small portion of land if that sale meant immediate layoffs and the dissolution of long-standing community ties. He detailed the plan, renegotiated debt, capital from his reserves, a temporary cut to his personal draw and sale of a non-essential asset to seed irrigation funding, and an immediate commitment from the board to a 5-year plan balancing yield improvements and community investment. It was not a promise of easy prosperity. It was a promise to shoulder risk. The reaction was mixed. Some investors withdrew funds. A few contractors balked at renegotiated margin rates. A journalist from the regional paper smelled a story and wrote a column that framed Elias as a sentimental idealist. The hits were real. Timelines for certain projects slipped.
The pressure in Elias's chest returned at times like a tide. But the choice also unlocked something else. In the weeks that followed, community support coalesced in ways not easily counted. Customers at the farmers market began to ask where the farm's produce came from and responded with loyalty when told of the childcare program and the workers' fund. A nearby co-op placed a modest contract with the farm because they valued ethically grown food. A small foundation offered a grant to support the nursery's training program. These were not instant miracles. They were threads that, when woven, strengthened a web. The farm learned to earn new clientele with stories and accountability. The Workers' Fund dispersed its first emergency grant to a seasonal worker whose small trailer had burned in a late-night spark. The grant paid for temporary housing and the replacement of a few essential tools. It was a small action that, in collective terms, announced the standard. The farm would not let its own fall off the cliff if feasible alternatives existed. The nursery's expansion allowed 2 more women to re-enter the workforce because they could now bring their children and feel certain someone would be there. These small recoveries mattered. Clarissa's life found a steadier track. She no longer fluttered at the edges of the farmhouse's corridors. She took on more responsibilities, scheduling, a basic training module she designed for new hires around crate labeling and supplier relations, and a small informal support group for parents that met 1 evening a week in the nursery's back room. Her confidence was not a sudden armor, but a quietly accruing skill. She learned to sign her name without the tremor that had been a habit in the first month. Juan watched and let his fists relax. There were tender moments that sealed the change in ways numbers could not capture. One afternoon, a violent thunderstorm rolled in. Sheets of rain beat the fields and young seedlings bent under the heave of wind. The nursery roof began to leak in a corner. The workers scrambled to cover equipment. A bolt of lightning struck a power line, taking electricity for a few hours. The barn lights went out, and in the murky dark, the nursery's small lamps glowed like beacons. The triplets who had been napping were awakened and confused. Clarice soothed them and coordinated a plan. Move the littles to the upper packing shed where the lights were powered by an auxiliary generator. Round up warm blankets and notify parents. The response was immediate and communal. Men and women who had known each other for seasons lifted crates, moved cots, and formed a human chain. Elias appeared in his boots, sleeves rolled, and worked quietly alongside them, carrying a box, whispering instructions into a walkie-talkie, and tending to a crying child when asked. The moment felt like a kind of intimacy the farm had been starved of. People acting as necessary parts of a whole.
When the storm subsided, not a single family was left stranded. A neighbor who had been skeptical afterward hugged Clarice and said, with an awkward sincerity, "You did good by bringing this inside. You helped us keep the children safe." That night, Elias sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had grown cold but was warm in his hands anyway. He thought of the small hands motif that had, from the beginning, simplified a complicated thing. Children trusted him, and that trust had become a compass. He understood, finally, that leadership required not just money and decisions, but presence. His grief did not evaporate, it changed shape. Grief had taught him boundaries, the need to protect what he loved. But now, grief shared space with accountability. Conflict did not die. There were setbacks that forced humility. A drought the following summer reduced yield in one greenhouse. A machine broke down at a critical moment, and scheduling late nights led to exhaustion. A contractor, resentful that his margin had been reduced, declined to renew his agreement at the end of the season. Each setback required concrete adjustments, tighter budgets, more rigorous maintenance scheduling, and a renewed push to maximize yields through better soil management. Through all this, Elias kept the policy commitments public. He signed a new charter opening the Workers' Fund to audit and oversight, with a committee that included 2 workers' representatives, Ms. Patel and Hal. The policy documented how decisions were made, how grants were approved, and how training funds were allocated. It made the governance of empathy both formal and practical. Clarice's role broadened beyond the office. She became a liaison, not a charity case. She organized the rotation of mothers who volunteered for nursery shifts in return for training hours that could lead to paid positions. She negotiated a bulk discount with a local bakery to provide lunches at a reduced cost for nursery kids. She held a small graduation for the first cohort of trainees, and the nursery director gave certificates that were ceremonial in one way but plausible in another. They mattered because they could be shown. João stood at the back of the room that day with a quiet, tearful grin. He had been wary for so long that when he let himself imagine a longer horizon for his sister, the relief changed him. Time, which had once felt like a slow erosion, became a witness to gentle accumulation. The farm's morale shifted in the most human of ways. People who had walked in cautious lines began to laugh with one another in the washroom line. A woman who had once traded tips on which neighbors to trust now shared a new recipe. Children began to play outside the nursery during their lunch breaks, and strangers stopped being unknown. Trust, like soil, needed tending. 2 years after the first night the triplets climbed into Elias's lap, the pilot program completed its formal review. Metrics had been set: retention rates of seasonal workers, nursery attendance numbers, productivity per acre, and local purchasing as a proportion of the farm's expenditures. The numbers were not all green. Some yields were flat, and a few months had required difficult compromises. But the retention rates had improved noticeably. The nursery served a larger portion of the workforce, and the community's welfare indicators showed modest, meaningful gains. Investors who had once balked found reasons to stay. Those who wanted immediate liquidity had left, but not without a clear comprehension of what they were giving up. Some new partners arrived, attracted not by quick profit, but by long-term sustainability and the farm's publicly stated ethics. The farm's public image had changed in small, practical ways. New contracts with a local co-op, a small line of direct-to-consumer produce launched with stories of stewardship printed on labels, and a modest increase in community engagement events. The human payback for Elias was less calculable. He slept better. He woke with small anticipatory pleasures rather than a sense of suffocation. He had friends he could call who were not accountants. His grief, still present, moved from an ache that sharpened everything into something that lived beside him, less demanding of his constant vigilance. He kept his father's photograph on the desk, but now it sat among other photographs. The first day the nursery opened, Clarice holding a certificate with a grin, the triplets asleep in a row with crumbs on their shirts. The ledger still spoke in its whispering way, but it no longer made all other voices small. There was one moment, some months later, that sealed the private and public arcs into a single scene. The county agricultural fair had a small farmers' expo, and Elias had been asked to speak about the farm's programs. He prepared nothing grand. He said a few honest sentences about risk and numbers, and then, without much artifice, told the story of 3 small hands that had startled him awake to something he had been avoiding. He did not invoke self-heroism. He credited a community. He credited Clarice. He credited the nursery and the workers' fund, and the slow idea that stewardship meant more than preserving acres on a map. After his few words, a woman in the audience stood up and spoke of how the nursery had saved her from the impossible choice of staying home or losing her job. A foreman spoke about how steadier attendance meant more predictable yield. A journalist asked a pointed question about the extended cost. Elias answered. He also stepped aside so others would be heard. The applause that followed was polite, but it was more substantive than presentation style. It was recognition from people who had borne witness. Clarice, standing near the edge of the tent with the triplets clinging to her skirt, smiled in the kind of way that was both surprised and quietly proud.
Joanne, beside her, had a look of someone who had finally relaxed his guard and found the future had authority now. The story did not end with fanfare. There were still budgets to balance, and nights when the work felt like walking uphill. There were still things that ought to have been done differently. But the dominant tone had shifted from anxiety to steadiness. Elias had not cured the farm of all risk. He had simply made a choice that tied his fortunes to the lives who worked the land in ways that were not merely rhetorical. On a late afternoon of clear air and low sun, the 5 of them, Elias, Clarice, Joanne, and the 3 triplets, found themselves at the edge of a new seedling bed. The nursery's offshoot program had started a small plot of heirloom tomatoes, and the children were allowed to help plant the seedlings. The boys ran ahead, small hands deep in soil, getting mud on their knees and laughing with the clean, fundamental joy that belongs to people learning how to coax green from earth. Elias crouched and showed the oldest how to press a seedling's roots into place without tearing its tender base. Clarice guided the middle boy's small hands and corrected him gently. Joanne stood with his arms crossed but smiling, a man who had learned to loosen his grip. Miss Patel called from the packing shed where the other children had been told to look for worms and marvel at the tiny creatures. Regina waved from the farmhouse porch. Vanessa, who had not fully joined them in warmth, but who had reduced her hostility to a quiet respect, passed by and tipped a hat. It was not a tableau of flawless harmony. It was a living portrait of people who had chosen to stay. The motif that began in a lamplit office, the small hands finding purchase, felt at home in the garden. There was something democratic about planting. The work returned what it had been given. Elias dug fingers into soil and felt earth crumb between his skin. He looked down at the triplets, at the streaks of dirt on their noses, at the way Clarice watched them with a softened intensity, and he understood with a clarity that cut to the bone why he had refused to sign certain papers. The decisions he had made had a cost and a return that was not only financial. As the sun slid behind the barn and the sky turned to a wash of pale purple, the 5 of them gathered and sat on an overturned crate. Someone produced a small stash of biscuits. Laughter spun in small threads. The triplets traded stories about who would be the next to ride the tractor. Joanne joked about the oldest claim to be better at planting than Elias. Clarice laughed in a way that sounded like a place letting go of a held breath. Elias listened and felt his chest ease. His grief remained, like a quiet room in the house of himself he visited now and then. But it no longer dominated the house. It had become part of the architecture, one room among many. He had been made accountable to himself, to a mission, and to a community. In choosing people over immediate profit, he had not saved himself in a tidy way. He had been steadied by the reciprocity that stewardship demands. When the boys fell asleep that evening, warm and heavy in their beds at the nursery, Clarice sat for a long time on the porch, her hands folded in her lap. João leaned his shoulder against hers and did not speak. The air was full of the small nocturnal sounds of a farm, an owl calling, the distant creak of a gate, the softened murmurs of a dog in its sleep. Clarice felt tired and full, the way a person does after a day of honest work and meaningful wins. She looked up at the stars and thought of all the nights she had feared. Elias wandered back to his house, feeling the soft ache of a day well worn. He paused at the old oak and, almost by habit, set his hand on the rough bark. The touch of wood under his palm felt like a concord. He thought of his father's good-natured scolding about allowing sentiment to get in the way of practicality and wanted to tell him, were it possible, that sentiment had a practical application. He realized that his father had known, in a way he had now learned. Farms are not merely assets to be rebalanced, they are lives intersecting across generations. There was a quiet satisfaction in how the farm had rebalanced itself. Not perfect, not unmoving, but steadier. People were paid fairly, children were cared for, and those who had the knowledge of the land began to see a reflection of their worth in the ledger. It was a modest revolution, enacted through policy and patience. If this story reached you, if the image of small hands rearranging a life felt familiar or like a hope, perhaps you know someone who could use the reminder that choosing people matters. Share this with them. If you'd like to hear more stories where ordinary choices change many lives, subscribe and be part of the circle.